My name is Samantha, and I worked backstage in the music industry. The moment I stepped into the backstage of the 1988 Grammys, I felt the air change, not with excitement, but with tension. Glittering lights bounced off every surface, cameras clicked like a heartbeat, and performers scurried between dressing rooms like ants. I had worked in music before, but nothing prepared me for this level of chaos. And then I saw him, Michael Jackson. Not the image everyone adored on stage or in videos, but the real man, exhausted, meticulous, and painfully aware of every eye in the room. I was assigned to his team, and my heart nearly stopped. Meeting Michael Jackson wasn't just a career milestone, it felt like standing at the edge of history. He moved with that quiet confidence, shoulders slightly hunched, as if carrying the weight of the world. People greeted him with forced smiles, careful politeness that barely concealed envy and tension. Even from where I stood, I could feel the electric mix of admiration and resentment swirling around him. I followed him into a narrow hallway behind the stage, clutching my clipboard, trying to steady my racing heart. He barely noticed me at first, his eyes scanning the crew, the stage, the lights, calculating, judging, preparing. And then he glanced at me, and I swear, in that brief second, he saw that I was nervous, inexperienced, but loyal. He gave me the faintest smile, the kind that felt like a quiet lifeline in the madness around us. Even then, I sensed the storm gathering. Whispers floated through the hallways, too hushed to catch words, yet heavy with intent. A few executives exchanged subtle glances, the kind that spoke of long grudges and unspoken agendas. One of them smirked as Michael passed, and it wasn't the warm, congratulatory kind. It was predatory. I realized in that instant that this night wouldn't just be a celebration. Something else was lurking beneath the sequins and applause. I had a front row seat to the beginning of a betrayal that no one watching the broadcast would ever see. The cameras would capture only perfection, the flawless performance, the poised smile, the awards handed out in glittering envelopes. But backstage, in these narrow corridors and shadowed corners, the game was already being played. And Michael Jackson, the king of pop, the man the world adored, was about to face a subtle, calculated betrayal that would leave a mark no Grammy could erase. As the night drew closer, I started noticing the subtle undercurrents that most people never saw. Backstage wasn't just a chaotic maze of lights, cameras, and costumes. It was a battlefield. Executives whispered in corners, their conversations clipped and cautious, yet heavy with meaning. I wasn't supposed to hear, but the hallways had ears, and mine was tuned. They weren't talking about Michael's talent. They were talking about control, influence, and power, the very things he had in abundance. I caught phrases like, "He's too powerful," "We can't let him dominate again," and "We need to balance the awards." My stomach tightened. Michael had transformed pop music, owned the charts, and his independence threatened the very structure of the industry. These weren't just jealous words, they were a blueprint. They were already planning how to minimize him tonight. I watched as producers and Grammy officials exchanged knowing glances whenever Michael passed by. Their smiles were polite, almost rehearsed, but their eyes were sharp, calculating. I realized this was more than business, it was personal. Every award he was expected to win had become a battleground, a statement about who truly controlled the music world. During rehearsal breaks, I tried to focus on my duties, but I couldn't ignore the tension. Michael moved among us, gracious and unassuming, unaware of the storm surrounding him. He laughed softly with his dancers, adjusted a sleeve, practiced a few steps. He was perfection itself, completely human and completely vulnerable. And I couldn't shake the feeling that tonight his brilliance would be tested in ways no one watching the broadcast would understand. By the time the first awards were announced, the plan was already in motion. The whispers, the shuffling of envelopes, the subtle nudges of influence, it all pointed to one thing. Michael Jackson was about to be denied, not because of talent or merit, but because of fear. And I was there, watching, heart in my throat, knowing I was witnessing something no one would talk about for decades. I stayed close during Michael's rehearsal, trying not to intrude, but every movement, every subtle expression he made demanded attention. He was meticulous as always, spinning on his heels, testing every note, his fingers hovering over the mic like it was an extension of his own heartbeat. He had been working tirelessly for months, yet he carried exhaustion with a quiet grace. There was no complaint, no frustration, just relentless perfection. But behind the polished veneer, I could see it. The strain in his eyes, the shadow that flickered when a producer shouted instructions or an executive barged past. He had grown used to being misunderstood, to being scrutinized, but the tension tonight was different. It wasn't about a mistake or a missed cue. Something else was brewing, and I could feel it crawling through the walls of the backstage corridors. The whispers of the executives followed us even into the rehearsal room. One of them lingered near the door, speaking just loud enough for me to catch fragments. "We can't let him sweep again. Too much control. Needs to be reminded." My stomach sank. I had never seen anything like this. Michael wasn't just talented, he was untouchable in the eyes of the fans. But to them, the executives, he was a threat. I tried to focus on my role, handing him water, adjusting a prop, ensuring the microphone was perfect. Yet every time he looked up, I caught a flicker of something vulnerable, an unspoken question in his eyes, as if he felt the weight of forces beyond the stage. And I knew then that this wasn't just another award show. It was a silent war. By the end of the rehearsal, Michael paused, wiping sweat from his brow. He smiled at his dancers, giving them reassurance, but when he glanced toward the side of the stage where the executives lingered, the joy faltered, replaced by a quiet, almost imperceptible tension. I realized that the night's magic was already tainted. Whatever happened next, it wouldn't be fair, and I had a front row seat to the beginning of a betrayal that no one watching the cameras would ever see. The backstage corridors were a whirlwind of motion, a blur of sequins, microphones, and hurried footsteps. Performers were rushing in and out of dressing rooms, assistants were running between cues, and the air smelled of hairspray, sweat, and anticipation. Yet, amid all the chaos, a strange stillness clung to the area where Michael prepared. It was as if the world paused for him, even though the people around him were buzzing with frantic energy. I walked beside him, clipboard in hand, trying to keep my hands steady. He moved with that quiet, controlled grace, adjusting a cuff, checking a strap, yet there was an almost imperceptible weight on his shoulders tonight. I had seen him exhausted countless times before, but tonight felt different. The energy surrounding him was tense, almost predatory, and I could feel it pressing down on him. Executives moved about the room with polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes. I noticed subtle shifts, seats being changed, envelopes being discreetly exchanged, whispers carried just loud enough to be overheard if you were listening carefully. Michael didn't notice, or if he did, he masked it perfectly with his usual composure. I, however, could feel the unease growing in the air. Something was off, and I didn't have to be psychic to know it. He paused for a moment, adjusting his glove, and I caught his reflection in a mirror. There was a flicker of tension in his eyes, a quiet question that no one dared to answer. He glanced toward the side of the stage where the Grammy officials lingered. Their smiles were cordial, but their posture was sharp, their movements calculated. I realized then that the night ahead would not be dictated by talent or merit. It would be dictated by fear, politics, and control. As the opening music began to play faintly in the auditorium beyond, Michael took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and smiled at me briefly. It was the kind of smile that carried both hope and defiance. I whispered under my breath, almost to myself, "They have no idea what they're up against." And in that heartbeat, I understood that the battle had already begun, long before he would step onto the stage. The auditorium lights dimmed, and the stage shimmered under the spotlight as the ceremony officially began. From backstage, I could see Michael standing quietly, watching from the wings, his posture impeccable, every move controlled. The audience applauded, cameras flashed, and yet beneath the glamour, the tension was almost suffocating. I could feel it vibrating through the floorboards, an invisible force pressing down on him. The first awards were announced, and Michael's category came up sooner than expected. He was predicted to sweep several of them, yet one by one the results were off. Not catastrophic, not publicly embarrassing, but enough to plant a seed of doubt. Executives exchanged subtle glances, almost imperceptible smirks, as the envelope revealed a winner who shouldn't have beaten him. I watched Michael clap, polite as ever, his face serene, but I caught that tiny flicker in his eyes, the question he never voiced aloud. I realized in that moment that the night wasn't about celebrating talent, it was about control. The votes, the envelopes, the sequencing of awards, they were orchestrated, designed to limit his victories, to remind everyone that no matter how high he rose, the industry still pulled the strings. My chest tightened. I had admired Michael's brilliance for years, but seeing the subtle, calculated undermining unfold in real time made my stomach twist. As the ceremony continued, the discrepancies grew. He didn't falter outwardly, he never did, but the perfectionism that defined him also magnified every small injustice. I could see it in the way he slightly stiffened after each announcement, how his hands trembled imperceptibly while clapping, how a shadow crossed his usually unshakable gaze. Behind glitz and applause, he was fighting silently, battling an invisible war that the audience would never notice. By the time the major award for Album of the Year approached, the tension backstage had reached a breaking point. Executives subtly shifted their positions, exchanging last-minute words, ensuring the outcome aligned with their agenda. I stood frozen, knowing what was about to happen. And in that heartbeat, I promised myself one thing. No matter what the night brought, I would be there to witness the truth, to hold the story of what really happened, because no camera lens would ever capture the betrayal unfolding right before my eyes. I could feel the night's energy shift as the envelopes were opened. The room buzzed with applause and flashes, but something darker hummed beneath the surface. Michael's name came up in categories where he was the clear frontrunner, yet the results didn't match expectations. I watched his smile, flawless on the outside, and felt the weight behind it. It was polite, controlled, but beneath it there was a flicker of confusion and quiet hurt that only a few of us could see. From my vantage point, I noticed subtle movements from the executives, tiny gestures, exchanged glances, hands brushing envelopes before they were presented. It was orchestrated, methodical. The awards weren't random, and this wasn't chance. Every minor loss, every unexpected win for someone else was calculated. Michael wasn't losing because he lacked talent. He was being contained, deliberately restrained by people who felt threatened by his success. I walked beside him briefly during a pause in the ceremony, holding a bottle of water, pretending to be busy. His eyes, however, found mine for a fleeting moment. I could see the question there without words. Why? I shook my head subtly, knowing there was nothing I could say to ease that invisible betrayal. The world saw a smiling superstar. Backstage, he was navigating a labyrinth of envy, politics, and fear. As the final major award approached, the tension backstage was almost tangible. I watched the subtle cues, the executive's hands lingering over envelopes, the quiet murmurs, the deliberate pacing. It was a silent orchestration of control. And though Michael remained outwardly graceful, his posture stiffened slightly, the flicker of doubt in his eyes now heavier, more pronounced. He knew something was off. By the time the results were revealed, I saw it, the quiet devastation he never voiced. He clapped politely, smiled at the winners, and moved on, but I caught the tension in his shoulders, the slight quiver in his jaw. That night, I realized the music industry hadn't just failed to celebrate brilliance, it had conspired to control it. And I, a silent witness, knew I had seen the beginning of a betrayal that would echo far beyond the glittering lights of the Grammys. After the ceremony ended, the backstage corridors emptied slowly, leaving a quieter, more somber atmosphere. Michael sat alone on a small folding chair near the dressing room, his sequin jacket slightly wrinkled, his glove resting on his lap. I hesitated for a moment, then approached him cautiously, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on both of us. The applause and flashing cameras had faded, leaving only the echo of what really happened. He didn't speak immediately, he just sat there staring at the floor, his eyes distant. I realized he was replaying everything, every category, every award, every subtle glance that didn't match the celebration. Finally, he asked softly, almost to himself, "Did they do this on purpose?" His voice carried no anger, only quiet disbelief, a man trying to understand how admiration could so easily turn into control. I explained what I had seen, the hushed conversations, the glances, the manipulation of envelopes. I watched as he processed the information, the faintest shadow of hurt crossing his features. He nodded slowly, a mix of resignation and defiance. "I knew the industry didn't love me like they claimed," he said quietly, "but I didn't think they would do this." His hands clenched slightly, the tiniest tremor betraying the effort it took to maintain his composure. I stayed with him, silent, as he took a deep breath and tried to steady himself. The man the world adored had been betrayed by the very people who should have celebrated him. And yet, even in that quiet moment of pain, there was a spark in his eyes, a determination that the night would not define him. He was hurt, yes, but he was not defeated. As we walked toward the exit together, I felt a surge of admiration and protectiveness. I knew that the cameras would never capture the real story, and the audience would never see the subtle betrayal that had unfolded behind the scenes. But I had witnessed it, and in that moment I silently vowed to remember, to carry the truth, and to honor the resilience of a man who deserved far more than what the industry had given him that night. Michael Jackson faced betrayal, manipulation, and industry politics, but his resilience and brilliance proved unstoppable. Watch the full story to see how he turned betrayal into ultimate triumph and left his enemies powerless. The next morning, the world awoke to headlines praising Michael Jackson's performance and charm, but subtly downplaying the night's controversy. I sat in the corner of his dressing room, scrolling through clippings and TV footage, and felt a pang of frustration. The cameras had captured his smile, the flawless routines, the glitzy awards, but they hadn't captured the quiet betrayal that had unfolded just hours earlier. No one outside those backstage walls could see the careful orchestration designed to limit him. News anchors lauded the king of pop for his professionalism, his talent, his poise under pressure. Yet, behind every carefully crafted segment, the subtle politics were invisible. The awards he should have swept were either omitted or given with minimal fanfare. I watched Michael's face as he flipped through the clippings, and though he smiled politely at the praise, there was a distant look in his eyes, a mixture of disappointment and the quiet fire of determination. The media was oblivious to what we knew. Producers and executives were smiling publicly, giving interviews about a balanced award show, but I knew the truth. Their calm, polished statements masked an agenda that had unfolded in whispers and glances backstage. It was a game, and Michael had been the most skilled player on the board, yet the system had tried to box him in. I watched him take it all in silently, leaning back in the chair, fingertips pressed together. He spoke softly, almost to himself. "They think this will stop me. They think this will make me smaller." His voice carried no bitterness, only quiet resolve. I realized then that what the world saw as disappointment was only a momentary setback. He had survived it with grace, and that resilience would fuel his next moves. As I left his side to handle a few calls, I felt the stark contrast between public perception and backstage reality. The world would continue to celebrate Michael Jackson as a flawless superstar, unaware of the subtle manipulation that night. But I knew the truth, and I knew that the fire of his ambition, hurt though it was, would burn brighter than ever, and that the industry's betrayal, however calculated, would ultimately be their undoing. Backstage, after the cameras and applause had faded, I watched Michael sit quietly, a man caught between disappointment and determination. His shoulders were slightly hunched, but there was a strength in the set of his jaw, a quiet defiance that no award or manipulation could ever steal. He didn't speak much, but every subtle movement, the way he straightened his jacket, adjusted his glove, took a slow, deliberate breath, spoke volumes about his resolve. He looked at me with those deep, calculating eyes, and I could almost hear the thoughts running through his mind. He wasn't just upset about the awards. He was processing the betrayal, analyzing the motives, the politics, and jealousy that had dictated the evening. "They want to control me," he said softly, almost a whisper, "but they can't, not really." His voice carried both hurt and unwavering determination. I stayed near him, observing silently. He was already thinking ahead, imagining the next album, the next tour, the next performance where no one could dictate the rules. The night's betrayal hadn't broken him, it had sharpened him, focused his energy into something fiercer, more resilient. I realized then that this quiet moment of reflection was not just recovery, it was the beginning of a renewed strategy, a mental blueprint for reclaiming control of his career. There was a subtle tension in the room, a blend of admiration and fear from the few people still present. Michael's aura had shifted, no longer just a superstar performing for the world, but a man aware of the stakes, understanding the lengths to which others would go to limit him. And yet, despite the political games and whispered betrayals, there was a calm clarity in his eyes. He would rise above, not with anger, but with precision and vision. As I left the room that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that history had just witnessed a pivotal moment. Michael Jackson had been tested, subtly betrayed, yet unbroken, and I knew deep in my bones that the night's politics, the manipulation, and the envy would pale in comparison to the legacy he was destined to build. Even in betrayal, he had found his resolve, and it was unstoppable. While Michael retreated to process the evening, I lingered nearby, observing the executives as they slinked back into their private corner of backstage. Their smiles were polished, their laughter controlled, but the undercurrent was unmistakable, satisfaction wrapped in subtle arrogance. I realized that from their perspective, they weren't doing anything wrong. They were protecting a system, maintaining order, ensuring no one artist, even Michael Jackson, disrupted the delicate hierarchy of the music industry. One executive whispered to another, "We can't have him sweeping everything again next year. It sets a precedent. Too much control, too much influence." Their words dripped with calculated concern, as if they were making a noble decision rather than orchestrating a betrayal. I could feel the cold logic in their statements. Michael's dominance was a threat, and they were determined to contain it, to subtly remind him and everyone watching that talent alone didn't dictate outcomes. I noticed the careful planning in every gesture. Hands lingered over envelopes before they were presented. The timing of announcements was deliberate. Even the camera angles and the sequencing of performances were subtly aligned to favor other nominees. They were invisible manipulations, untraceable by the public, yet perfectly executed by those who understood the inner workings of the Grammys. Their calm, controlled discussion continued, oblivious to the chaos of emotions they had left in their wake. They rationalized it as industry balance or fair distribution of awards, but the intent was clear to me. This wasn't about fairness, it was about control. And the irony was stark. While the world cheered for Michael Jackson, these very people were quietly trying to clip the wings of the man who had redefined pop music. As I watched them exit, I felt a mix of awe and anger. These were the invisible forces that shaped careers, determined victories and defeats, and yet claimed innocence in their actions. And I knew, even then, that the night's betrayal would not stay buried. It would fuel a fire within Michael, a determination that no executive, no vote, and no envelope could ever suppress. Backstage, the machinery of the Grammys hummed quietly, but beneath the polished facade, every move was choreographed with purpose. I wandered through the hallways, clipboard in hand, trying to appear busy while absorbing the quiet orchestration around me. Stage managers whispered last-minute adjustments, producers shifted camera cues, and assistants carried envelopes with an almost ceremonial care. Every gesture felt deliberate, every glance calculated. I noticed a small cluster of executives near the control booth. Their murmurs were clipped, but I caught fragments. Hold off this award, delay his announcement, keep the focus elsewhere. Even without seeing the screens, I understood their strategy. This wasn't chaos, it was calculated manipulation. The awards Michael should have won were being redirected, subtly diminished by timing, sequencing, and presentation, and no one in the audience, nor anyone watching at home, would suspect a thing. Michael's team moved around him, trying to maintain calm and composure. He remained polite, gracious, yet I could see the subtle tension in his body language, the slight stiffness, the way his hands occasionally clenched, the brief pauses before smiles. I realized that his professionalism was shielding the world from seeing the subtle betrayal unfolding around him. He carried the weight of manipulation with the elegance of a master, yet no one could deny the strain beneath the perfection. I felt a pang of helplessness watching it all. There was nothing I could do to change the outcome, no envelope to open differently, no microphone to adjust. All I could do was witness, record in my memory the quiet injustice being played out. And yet, in Michael's eyes, I saw resilience. He wasn't naive. He understood the politics, the envy, the careful control that surrounded him. But he was still determined to rise above it, to let his talent speak louder than the whispers behind the scenes. As the moments ticked closer to his performance, the tension grew. Every small delay, every calculated glance from executives, every whispered instruction was a reminder. The night was being shaped not just by talent, but by invisible hands. And I knew that what the cameras would show, the flawless performance, the sparkling smile, the applause, was only half the story. Behind the sequins and lights, a quiet betrayal had taken place, one that would linger far beyond the glittering night. The auditorium lights dimmed further, and a hush fell over the crowd as Michael stepped onto the stage. From backstage, I could feel the electricity ripple through the air. Every eye in the room was on him, yet no one outside this chaotic backstage bubble could sense the tension that had been quietly building for hours. Michael moved with the effortless precision that had made him the king of pop, yet beneath every spin and glide, I could see the weight of the evening pressing on him. I held my breath as the opening notes filled the auditorium, watching his body synchronize perfectly with the music. Every step, every gesture, every subtle tilt of his head conveyed artistry, emotion, and control. Yet from where I stood, I could detect the undercurrent, the slight tightening of his jaw, the subtle pause before each move, a man performing under the shadow of betrayal while still radiating brilliance. The cameras focused on the crowd, capturing cheers and applause, but I stayed fixed on Michael. He was performing not just for fans, but against the invisible forces that had tried to limit him. Each flawlessly executed spin, each iconic step was a statement of resilience, a quiet defiance against the subtle manipulation that had unfolded backstage. The audience didn't know it, but every move was a victory in itself. I could see him glance toward the side of the stage where the executives lingered. Their smiles were polite, but I caught the faintest flicker of unease in their eyes, as if they sensed that their quiet orchestration couldn't diminish the force of his performance. Michael's energy was magnetic, commanding attention, transforming betrayal into artistry, turning manipulation into motivation. As the final notes played and the crowd erupted, I realized that the performance wasn't just about winning awards or public adoration. It was about asserting presence, reclaiming power, and demonstrating that no behind-the-scenes politics, no subtle betrayal could ever take away his brilliance. And in that moment, backstage and out front, I knew that Michael Jackson had turned the night's betrayal into a triumph the world would never fully understand. The performance ended, and the audience erupted into a thunderous standing ovation. From backstage, I could see Michael bowing gracefully, his smile radiant, his energy unbroken. Yet the applause that filled the room couldn't mask the subtle tension lingering behind the curtains. While the world celebrated, the whispers and calculated glances of the executives reminded me that the night's manipulation hadn't disappeared. It had only been temporarily overshadowed by brilliance. I followed him as he retreated behind the stage. The brief escape from the spotlight gave him a moment to exhale, yet I could see the strain in his posture. His gloves still glimmered under the backstage lights, but the sparkle couldn't hide the quiet weight of betrayal he carried. I tried to offer reassurance with a small smile, and he nodded faintly, acknowledging both my presence and my understanding of what had occurred. Executives continued their subtle movements around the backstage area, some smiling, others whispering, but all maintaining their carefully constructed appearances. They were aware that his performance had captivated the audience, yet their control had been only partially undone. Every calculated envelope, every delayed announcement, every subtle restriction had still left its mark, and Michael, the man the world adored, knew it. I watched as he retreated to a quieter corner, checking details for the next performance and reviewing schedules with his team. There was a calm determination in his eyes, a quiet refusal to let the night's politics dictate his future. Every interaction, every gesture conveyed a silent message. They could manipulate the awards, control appearances, and whisper behind the scenes, but they could never diminish his spirit or his talent. As I stood there observing him, I felt a mixture of admiration and anger. The world would see only the triumph, the flawless performance, the applause, but I had witnessed the betrayal behind the glittering lights, and I knew the truth. Michael Jackson had been tested, subtly undermined, and yet he had emerged stronger, sharper, and more determined. The night's events were not an end, they were a spark, igniting a fire that no manipulation could extinguish. Back in the quieter corridors of the backstage area, Michael's composure remained intact, but I could sense a simmering tension beneath it. He wasn't angry in the theatrical, explosive sense. He was meticulous, controlled, but every small movement carried weight, a quiet fury that burned silently. His eyes, usually soft and warm, now scanned the room with precision, cataloging every glance, every whispered conversation, every subtle gesture that had undermined him tonight. I approached cautiously, not wanting to break his focus. "It's over," I said softly, though even I knew it wasn't over. The betrayal had already taken root, its consequences unfolding silently around him. He didn't respond immediately, instead letting a deep breath escape, a rare pause where his shoulders relaxed just slightly. Then he looked at me, eyes sharp and clear. "They think I won't notice," he said, voice low but steady, "but I do, and I never forget." There was a quiet intensity in his words that made me shiver. This wasn't just about stolen awards. It was about respect, control, and the subtle ways the industry tried to dictate his legacy. Every whispered plan, every manipulated envelope, every calculated smile had failed to break him. Instead, it had sharpened his focus, fueled a resolve that I had never seen in anyone else. I watched as he moved around his dressing area, adjusting costumes, reviewing notes, rehearsing gestures. Each action was precise, deliberate. It was as if he were silently planning a way to rise above every restriction, to reclaim every ounce of respect and recognition that had been subtly stolen from him tonight. The quiet fury in him was not destructive, it was strategic, a controlled fire that promised inevitability. As the night wound down and the last applause echoed faintly from the stage, I realized something profound. While the executives thought they had controlled the narrative, they had underestimated him. Michael Jackson was not merely a performer, he was a strategist, a visionary, and now, more than ever, a man whose quiet fury would not allow betrayal to go unanswered. And I, as a witness to it all, understood that this night would not be forgotten, not by him, not by me, and certainly not by history. The morning after the Grammys, the world was buzzing with headlines about Michael Jackson's performance, yet the subtle betrayal remained hidden in the shadows. I watched him sit quietly in his private space, sipping a glass of water, scrolling through news articles. Publicly, he was hailed as flawless, graceful, and untouchable, but privately, he carried the weight of a night carefully orchestrated against him. The applause didn't erase the whispers behind the scenes, nor the envelopes that had been subtly redirected. He finally spoke, voice measured but tinged with restrained anger. "They think tonight defined me," he said, staring out the window at the city lights. "They think one evening of politics can stop years of work, years of passion. They're wrong." There was a quiet intensity in his words that left no room for doubt. He wasn't hurt beyond repair. He was strategizing, planning his next move in silence. I could see the determination in every movement. Michael began reviewing footage from the performance, not to critique himself, but to see the angles the world hadn't noticed, the control he wielded even when circumstances were stacked against him. Each gesture, each expression, each note he had sung flawlessly was a reminder that the betrayal of the night hadn't broken him, it had refined him. Executives called, attempting to offer public congratulations, their voices overly polite, even cautious. Michael listened, smiled faintly, and responded graciously, but I could see the subtle calculation behind his words. He was not naive. He knew the manipulation that had occurred, and he was already thinking several steps ahead, envisioning a path where his brilliance could not be quietly contained again. By the end of the day, I realized that the true power of Michael Jackson wasn't in the awards he won or lost. It was in his resilience, his capacity to transform betrayal into motivation. The night had tried to diminish him, yet it had achieved the opposite. He was stronger, sharper, and more determined than ever, and I, a silent witness, understood that this was only the beginning of how he would redefine control, success, and respect in the music industry. In the days following the Grammys, Michael's focus shifted from performance to perspective. I watched as he began rebuilding the network around him, quietly evaluating who deserved his trust and who had shown themselves to be manipulators hiding behind polished smiles. It was subtle work, strategic, almost surgical in its precision. He had learned that talent alone wasn't enough. Knowing who to trust was just as crucial. We spent hours going through notes, meetings, and schedules, analyzing every interaction from the night of the awards. Michael didn't vent or complain, he observed. He cataloged gestures, whispers, and decisions with the meticulous eye of a man who understood that betrayal often wore a mask of civility. Every pause, every smile, every envelope handed off with care had been recorded in his mind, and now he was using that knowledge to protect his future. He began reinforcing his team, surrounding himself with people whose loyalty was proven, whose motives were transparent. I noticed a subtle shift in his energy, a calm, steady confidence that radiated even in casual moments. There was no trace of vengeance in the theatrical sense, only a sharp, strategic clarity. Michael knew he couldn't erase the betrayal, but he could ensure it wouldn't happen again and that it wouldn't define him. During one quiet afternoon, he leaned back in his chair, looking at the city skyline. "I won't let them manipulate me like that again," he said softly, almost to himself. "And I'll make sure every move I make now, every decision, every performance carries the weight of truth and resilience." His voice was calm, but the conviction was palpable. I realized then that his response to betrayal wasn't anger, it was wisdom, focus, and unshakable determination. By the end of that week, Michael had not only analyzed the betrayal, but also laid the foundation for moving forward. He understood that trust was earned, loyalty was rare, and brilliance could be overshadowed but never erased. I felt honored to witness this transformation, the quiet reclamation of power by a man who refused to be diminished, and I knew with certainty that the night of subtle betrayal had not weakened him, it had forged a stronger, wiser, and unstoppable Michael Jackson. Weeks passed, and Michael shifted from reflection to action. I watched as he meticulously planned his next moves, turning the quiet fury from the Grammys into a disciplined strategy. He wasn't seeking revenge in the obvious sense. He wanted control over his art, his career, and the narrative that surrounded him. Every meeting, every call, every decision carried purpose, ensuring that no one could quietly undermine him again. He began reclaiming influence over key decisions, scheduling, production choices, and performance details. Michael's instincts were flawless, refined from years of navigating an industry that often placed politics above talent. He scrutinized proposals, reviewed contracts personally, and demanded transparency from everyone involved. The quiet, calculated fire in his eyes was impossible to ignore. It was the look of someone who had been tested and emerged sharper, unwilling to ever be underestimated again. I saw him reach out to allies, reinforcing loyalty while subtly sidelining those whose intentions were unclear. It wasn't harsh, but it was firm, a strategic recalibration that signaled he would no longer allow anyone to manipulate his achievements or his legacy. With each decision, each action, Michael's confidence grew, and the backstage tension that had plagued him at the Grammys began to dissipate. During one late-night session, reviewing footage of past performances, he paused and said softly, "They tried to make me smaller, but every move I make now will remind them of what they underestimated." His voice carried calm precision, not bitterness, but the unmistakable clarity of someone who had learned the rules of the game and was now rewriting them on his own terms. By the end of the week, I realized that Michael wasn't just taking control of his career, he was reclaiming his narrative, asserting his power, and transforming betrayal into strategy. The industry might have tried to contain him at the Grammys, but in doing so, they had awakened an even stronger, more formidable version of the King of Pop. And I, as a witness, knew that nothing could dim his brilliance now. Not envelopes, not whispers, not politics, and certainly not betrayal. Michael's next step was subtle but powerful. He didn't announce vengeance or publicly call out the industry. He let his actions speak. I watched him meticulously plan interviews, performances, and public appearances with one clear goal: to reclaim his narrative without letting the manipulators take credit or attention. Every word, every gesture, every performance was carefully crafted to show the world that he remained untouchable, even when behind-the-scenes betrayal tried to tell a different story. He began speaking more openly about his music, his inspiration, and the hard work behind each performance. Interviews were infused with humility, passion, and authenticity, but there was also an unmistakable edge, a quiet declaration that he would not allow subtle undermining to go unnoticed. Michael's words didn't attack anyone directly, but anyone paying attention could sense the truth. He had been tested and emerged stronger. I watched him rehearse for upcoming performances, scrutinizing every detail, demanding perfection, not out of ego, but out of principle. The stage became his arena to demonstrate not just talent, but control, resilience, and the ability to rise above manipulation. Each dance move, each note sung, carried the weight of the betrayal behind the Grammys, yet shone with the brilliance of someone refusing to be diminished. Even in casual backstage moments, Michael's confidence radiated differently. He engaged with his team more assertively, trusting only those whose loyalty had been proven. He navigated the complex network of industry politics with the skill of a master strategist, turning potential obstacles into opportunities. The quiet betrayal that had threatened to destabilize him now fueled a precise, controlled ascent that no one could manipulate. By the end of the month, the industry began to notice the shift. Executives who once whispered and maneuvered quietly now approached him with a newfound respect, aware that he had reclaimed control. And as I watched Michael walk confidently into every meeting, every rehearsal, every spotlight, I realized that the subtle betrayal of the Grammys had not weakened him. It had forged an unbreakable force, a king of pop whose brilliance and resilience would define history. Months after the Grammys, the echoes of betrayal had faded in the public eye, but I witnessed every private moment of Michael's transformation. He was no longer the man quietly navigating manipulation. He was a force, intentional in every decision, confident in every performance, and untouchable in his presence. The industry could attempt subtle control, but he had outmaneuvered them at every turn. I watched him prepare for a televised global performance, and the difference was undeniable. Every move, every lyric, every expression radiated not only artistry, but authority. The quiet fury from the Grammys had evolved into precision, and the man on stage wasn't merely entertaining. He was asserting dominance, reminding the world why he was the king of pop. Behind the cameras, I could see the executives' glances shift from confidence to cautious respect. They realized that manipulation could no longer dictate outcomes. He didn't need awards to validate him. Michael's brilliance had become its own statement. Record-breaking sales, overwhelming public admiration, and iconic performances proved that the night of betrayal had only amplified his legacy. I felt a mix of awe and relief witnessing it. The same industry that had tried to contain him now had to reckon with a star whose power transcended their politics. Michael smiled at me after the performance, a quiet acknowledgement of what had transpired. No words were needed. The night had tested him, the executives had schemed, and yet here he stood, unbroken, stronger, and more magnetic than ever. The subtle betrayal had forged resilience, the industry's envy had fueled strategy, and the world had witnessed the emergence of a force no envelope or whisper could ever diminish. I realized then that victory wasn't measured in awards, it was measured in control, resilience, and the ability to transform betrayal into enduring brilliance. And as I watched Michael walk off stage, head held high, I knew that the King of Pop had rewritten the rules, and no one would ever forget the power, grace, and quiet triumph born from a night of betrayal. Months turned into years, and the subtle betrayal of the 1988 Grammys slowly became a footnote in public memory. But behind the scenes, the people who had orchestrated the manipulations felt the consequences quietly but unmistakably. Deals fell through, trust evaporated, and reputations, once polished, began to crack under their own weight. I watched as the industry's carefully constructed hierarchy shifted, and the executives who had tried to control Michael found themselves sidelined, their influence waning. Meanwhile, Michael's career soared higher than anyone could have anticipated. Every new release, every performance, every award he won carried more than artistic brilliance. It carried the quiet, unshakable proof that betrayal had not destroyed him. It had, in fact, strengthened him. He no longer relied on approval from the same people who had tried to undermine him. The world's recognition and his own resilience were enough. I remember sitting with him during a late-night studio session, watching him laugh over a melody, completely at ease. The tension, the subtle fury, the shadow of betrayal, they were gone, replaced with a serene confidence that radiated from every pore. "They tried to stop me," he said softly, "but karma has a way of correcting itself, and I don't need to do anything. It unfolds naturally." His words were calm, almost philosophical, yet they carried the weight of truth. The people who had schemed, who had whispered, who had subtly manipulated envelopes and opportunities eventually faced their own setbacks. Contracts lost, projects delayed, opportunities vanished. They had built their empires on subtle control, and the very system they had trusted turned against them. Michael's brilliance, integrity, and resilience had revealed the fragility of manipulation, proving that talent paired with resolve was unstoppable. As I watched Michael step onto yet another stage, greeted by roaring applause and unwavering admiration, I understood that the night of betrayal had not only tested him, it had defined his power. Karma had quietly and inevitably aligned, rewarding truth, resilience, and brilliance while exposing deceit and envy. And in that full circle moment, I realized that Michael Jackson, the man who had faced subtle betrayal and manipulation, had emerged untouchable, immortalized not only as an artist, but as a force that even betrayal could never diminish.